be back out on the Outer Banks. My name is Alexandra Sirota. I'm the director at the Budget and Tax Center. We are a project of the North Carolina Justice Center, which is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that works to address poverty across the state. We do that by doing research and analysis into economic conditions. We look at the best policy solutions to build an economy that works for everyone, and we communicate that broadly across the state and with our policymakers. So I'm excited to be here to share with you some of our recent analysis into how the economy is doing and what the role of public policy is. I want to start by asking a question of you all. What in your minds does an economy that works for everyone look like? And you can feel free to just sort of shout out what are the things that you look for when you see something that is happening in your community, in your economy. You say that means that my economy is working well for everybody.
Living wage.
Living wage.
No hungry kids.
No hungry kids.
Low unemployment.
Low unemployment. There was one in the back.
People able to sustain themselves and not have to go into the system.
Say that again.
People able to sustain themselves and not have to...
Cash registers ringing.
Cash registers ringing. Great. Well, I think that is a perfect segue for a very short video I want to show you. Okay, so I think as we think about what is happening in North Carolina's economy, it's clear that North Carolina's economy is not working the way that we would want it to see, that not everyone has the opportunities or the earnings to really participate fully in the economy. And that's really because our policies haven't focused on the issue of wages, on the issue of the drivers of better wages in our economy. And those things are both setting wage standards, but also making sure that people have access to the education and skills training that allow them to demand higher wages because they're more trained. It means that jobs are created in communities that are good quality jobs. So there's a real need to focus on these policies that are proven to make a difference for working families. So I'm going to walk through some data about why this really hasn't been the Carolina comeback that we've all heard about. And it's very clear when you look at the data that while the unemployment rate has clearly fallen, what's happening at the same time is that a large number of people are not participating in the labor force anymore. And because of that low level of participation, we actually probably have a much higher unemployment rate because people leave the labor force when they feel like there's no job opportunity for them. And it doesn't get captured in the official unemployment rate. So with this graph, what you see is that when you include these missing workers, the folks that would otherwise be looking for work, that the unemployment rate actually has stayed relatively stable, even despite the recovery, and remains pretty elevated in the double digits. We do see some decline here that's important to note in the recent period. And this is distinct from our history. So in North Carolina's workforce has actually had better employment levels than the nation. So you look, historically speaking, North Carolina's employment levels have been higher than the United States on average. And at peak, we were in the mid-60s, so almost 65% of our population in North Carolina was working. As of the Great Recession, the first recession really in 2001, that trend has shifted, and now North Carolina's employment levels are actually below the nation. So we're actually lagging the nation in providing the kinds of employment opportunities that are needed, again, to include everyone in the economy. And so I think it's important to note, this is not to say that job creation isn't happening. We all know that the the national economy is experiencing a recovery. We've been in a recovery period since July 2009. That recovery came to North Carolina a little bit later in 2010. Our job growth is happening. It's been very sluggish. And as you can see in this graph, when you look at our job creation relative to the nation, depending on the time period you look at, two things come forward. One, North Carolina is actually not performing all that much better than the nation over various time periods, particularly in 2015. You can see that we've started to slow down our rate of job creation over the past period. Certainly, we know that since the start of the Great Recession, North Carolina has not grown as many jobs as the nation coming out through the recession to the current period. In the last year, we did have a slightly higher job growth than the country. But again, that data shows us that it's really important to think about what your time period is of comparison, and that North Carolina's recovery is very much being driven by a national recovery. A lot of these trends in the economy are happening at a very macro level, and they aren't being driven necessarily by policy changes made here in the recent period. And I can add to that argument by saying when we look across tax-cutting states, for example, which was one major argument that gets made, that because of the tax cuts in 2013, we've actually seen job creation result. Well, if you look at this graph, which looks at the major tax-cutting states across the country, it's actually the case that most of tax-cutting states, all of them really, have underperformed the nation over the period marking their tax cut implementation to the current time. So again, what we're seeing is a national recovery that's driving North Carolina's recovery. It's been very sluggish and insufficient to create the numbers of jobs that we need to see. But we can't just look at the number of jobs because, as I talked about at the beginning, the most important thing in an economy, in addition to having the right number of jobs, right, we need to have jobs in our economy, is to also have jobs that can sustain people and families and communities as a result. So what we know is that there's been this very long-term trend in the United States, and most economists call it the Great Divergence. And they call it a Great Divergence because what's happened is a divergence, a breaking apart of the relationship that once existed, that was very strong, between a worker's productivity and their pay. As workers became more productive, as they produced more goods and services, their pay increased. Beginning in the 70s, we started to see this relationship break apart. And as you can see on this trend line, it's only served to grow further and further apart. I think particularly of note in this graph is the fact that North Carolina's compensation in the recovery period has actually fallen. That is not what you would want to see in an economic recovery. Of course, as the economy's growing, as it's becoming more productive, you would want to see workers' wages growing. And that's not the trend that we're seeing on average in North Carolina. So this is just another way to tell that story. When we look at output data for North Carolina's output, we take all of the goods and services and value created in North Carolina, and we analyze how that gets distributed in the economy. We know that a portion of it, more than half, has traditionally gone to, nearly 60% has gone to workers in the form of wages or compensation. This trend, as with the nation, has been in decline. So we've seen that workers are receiving less of the value that they create in the form of wages. What this means in North Carolina is that if workers had been receiving the same level of, or the same share of the value that got created in the economy, there would be $24 billion more paid to workers today. So that's a significant dollar amount. That means that workers would have been able to buy more houses, they would have been able to buy more cars, they would have been able to shop, and begin to build pathways out of poverty and into greater middle class and economic security, had that relationship between their productivity and the wages they bring home been more tightly matched. So it's not surprising that we see a graph like this, right? This graph shows median household income in North Carolina falling as a result of the Great Recession, but continuing to remain low even in the recovery. So North Carolina, the official recovery began in 2009. We've continued to see declines, and it's sort of been flatlining since. And the median household income, just so you know, as a distinction from average, is just measuring the middle household, so the household that has 50% below, 50% above. They have $5,000 less than they did in 2007. Their purchasing power, their ability to go out into our local communities and spend has eroded over that time period. And that creates problems for businesses that require consumers in order to be able to expand and grow. So these trends around wages are happening at a time in which the costs of basic necessities are still rising. So workers have less money coming in, but greater costs on the very basic necessities, everything from shelter and food to childcare. Childcare is actually quite higher than either of these numbers, but this uses consumer price index data, and it shows you the change from the recession period until July of the cost of shelter and food. And you can see that it's growing quite fast relative to just general consumer items. So that creates a broken pathway to economic security. When folks don't have the wages coming in, they have rising costs, they're not able to create opportunity to participate in the economy and to build the assets necessary to secure a middle class lifestyle. We know that the way that we've thought for a long time about what families need is flawed. And this graph shows you that when you think about what it takes to make ends meet in North Carolina, we often use measures like the poverty line. Well, the poverty line nationally is $23,000 a year. For a minimum wage worker, so that's someone earning $7.25 an hour, you have two people earning that level, they'd be taking in $30,000 an hour. By our calculation, a living income standard is more, on average across North Carolina, is more like $52,000. And that's a very conservative estimate that we use based on publicly available data around the cost of transportation, childcare, housing, food, health insurance payments, and taxes. So what you see is that we don't even capture the true level of economic hardship that exists in our communities when we talk about poverty. And so when I go into my next slides, you'll say, well, what do these numbers really mean? And I think we need to question our use of them to some extent, because when I say that 1.7 million North Carolinians are living in poverty, that means they're living on average, if they're a family of four, on less than $23,000 a year. We know that more than double are living less than 200% of that measure, so about 46,000. That population, that 1.7 million people in North Carolina living in poverty, is the equivalent of the combined populations of the city of Asheville, Charlotte, Greensboro, Raleigh, and Wilmington. So that's a tremendous number of people who are struggling every day to make ends meet and participate in the economy And that in and of itself is creating a drag on the broader economy in which we're all living in. So I think this is important to say because this has been a trend that is different about this recovery than other recoveries. We have long thought that a rising tide lifts all boats, that as the economy recovers, as productivity increases, that poverty goes down. And that has been the historic trend, that as our economy grows, poverty declines. What we're seeing in this recovery is that our poverty rate is stalled in North Carolina. It's stalled at a very elevated rate of 17%. Our child poverty rate is 1 in 4 children in the state are living in poverty. These numbers are even worse when you look at the data by race and ethnicity, and even worse when you look at the data by race and ethnicity for children. So the poverty rate for African American children in North Carolina is almost half. So what we know is that in North Carolina, the demographics of our state are shifting, and that it is an economic imperative that poverty for any community not persist for a long period of time. We know that poverty has a tremendously damaging effect on young children. There's been a number of very interesting new research coming out on the actual brain development of children living in poverty and the damage that happens when children grow up in that context. And so when we know that our demographic shift is happening and yet such a large portion of our future leaders are living in poverty, it is really an economic imperative that we think about how to address poverty and particularly the barriers that communities of color face in our state. And one other piece of this is that we know that not only is there variation across community, across geography, across race and ethnicity, we know that the distribution of income, not just on averages, but when we break it down by income group, we see that almost half of the income is owned or held by the top 20% of North Carolinians. So what we're seeing is not only all of these wage issues happening for the average or medium worker, but we're seeing that growing a part of the community, that the sort of haves and have-nots that you often hear folks talk about is very much a reality, and we see it play out in a number of data points. This one is from the American Community Survey, just showing you how much income is held by different income groups. So I use this to preview sort of my next section of slides, which is we know what works to address poverty. We have known for many years what tools we need to make sure that people who are living in poverty don't bear a greater harm from that experience. And we know that one of the strongest pathways out of poverty is through education. And we know that in North Carolina very deeply. Our leaders in the beginning of this century built a public education system because they recognized that they needed to serve all children in the state and create that pathway for everyone. And this graph just shows you how true that holds, right? So the poverty rate for someone who has a bachelor's degree is 5%, significantly lower than someone who has not finished high school. So we know that those sorts of milestones are critical to creating opportunity and addressing poverty in our communities. So I'm going to move into a section of this talk that's about the role of policy. And for many folks, I think, We think that the economy happens around us and that we have no control over it. It's sort of like the weather, comes and goes, whims, at the whim of whatever. I think you all probably know better than most that the seasonality of the economy is also an issue, and the cycles of the economy, the economic downturns, economic expansions, all of those cycles, all of those changes that happen in our economy are existing, but they are framed by a set of policy choices that we make, and we can set the framework within which we make exchanges, we set wages, we allow for commerce to happen in our communities, and that's why the policy choices that we make around the economy are so important. So what kinds of policies are we thinking about in terms of what is needed to build an economy that works for everyone? First, as I talked about earlier, we know that poverty creates tremendous harm for families and for children. So we know that protecting people who are living in poverty from that harm is critical. That's why we invest in early childhood programs so that young children have opportunities to get that one-on-one attention and care in a safe environment. That's why we know that it's important for people to have food assistance so that they can put healthy food on the table. Again, we know that building pathways out of poverty is critical, and we do that through our investments in education, our investments in entrepreneurship, making sure that businesses have access to capital when they want to start up and expand an idea. And we know that we need to remove barriers that some groups experience, and that's very true across our state. And it's everything from the barriers that are part of our history to the barriers that persist today. It's everything from the experiences of dislocated workers in the mill towns of the Piedmont to the experiences in northeastern North Carolina. So those barriers require targeted responses and an intentional effort to really understand what will create opportunity for those groups. And then we need to sustain vibrant communities of opportunity in our state. And that means focusing not just on our urban centers, but understanding what rural communities and regional communities need to be economically vibrant. And it will look differently in rural North Carolina than it will look in urban North Carolina. But we can't continue to anticipate or expect that urban growth alone will create opportunity for everyone in our state. So this is just a little bit of data to back up some of these ideas. I think one of the things that we know is that some of the policies that are currently in place in the United States are quite effective at moving people out of poverty or lifting them out of poverty. And these are just 3 examples. Social Security, obviously when you look at Social Security over since elder poverty rates, since the implementation of Social Security, you see a tremendous decline in the poverty rates of older North Carolinians, older Americans. Here in North Carolina, you see almost 1 million North Carolinians lifted out of poverty as a result. The earned income tax credits and child tax credits, now federally available only, really do create a boost for many working families who are earning low wages to keep them out of poverty and, again, spending in their local communities. And food assistance is another one that has a tremendous impact locally. Folks are able to spend then at their local grocers to make sure that they have food on the table. So you meet both addressing the hunger needs that we're talking about earlier and creating a stabilizing force in local economies. Another key tool in making sure that the economic cycles that happen do not push people further into economic distress is the unemployment insurance system. In North Carolina, we have an unemployment insurance system that has been radically changed since 2013. And the result is that we're actually providing very little unemployment insurance payments to jobless workers. We have one of the lowest recipiency rates, that is, the number of jobless workers who actually receive unemployment insurance. Just out of curiosity, does anybody know how many North Carolinians receive unemployment insurance? Anybody want to guess?
250,000.
So it's actually 25,000. There are 250,000 unemployed workers in North Carolina.
Oh, but only 25,000 of them.
Only about 25,000 as of October 2015.
That's what I meant.
Yeah.
Wow.
You didn't spell it.
I appreciate you offering an answer.
I like that comparison.
So again, you see just how frayed the support system is and our policy system is. And this matters not just for that jobless worker. We know that in research that's been done nationally, that unemployment insurance system has a strong stabilizing effect in the overall economy. Because what it does is, while people are looking for work, allow them to maintain a very basic level of spending. This is a temporary wage replacement. It's not a complete wage replacement, but it provides some dollars so that they can continue to spend in the economy. Having learned the lesson of the Great Depression, where folks were not able to spend and you saw the economy continue to spiral down, 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 this was a policy that was enacted to provide a floor, a very basic level of subsistence while people wait until the jobs come back and can work. So I talked about food assistance again, this virtuous cycle, right, of the ability of people when they have income to be able to spend locally and to be able to participate in the economy. And ideally we want that to happen through wages, but when that is not a possibility, we know that these programs are critical to either closing the gap for those workers who earn too little or for supporting people who aren't able to work for whatever reason. Another policy idea, again, Medicaid expansion here, providing that coverage to folks who aren't fitting in the programs that are offered now. So there are about 500,000 North Carolinians who would be covered by Medicaid expansion who aren't currently. We talked about the earned income tax credit. And I think this new data, I just want to highlight what we know, again, about these programs that focus on addressing poverty is that they have a lifelong effect. We're increasingly seeing the earned income tax credit, I believe was first enacted by President Ford, expanded under Reagan, expanded again under Clinton. This is a policy that's been around for a while. So now we have data on how children have fared when their families have gotten this credit. And what we see is improved health outcomes, improved educational outcomes, and better income and lifetime earnings. So policy matters, and I think the other piece I want to leave you with is that budget and tax policy decisions matter and impact our daily lives. These investments that we make through our state budget build these pathways out of poverty. And right now in North Carolina, more than half of our state budget is invested in education, either early education, K through 12 education, community colleges, or the UNC system. Another large portion is invested in health and human services, everything from public health programming to social services to Medicaid. Those investments create an important foundation of opportunity in our communities. And at the state level, because they are supported through state revenue, are able to ensure that all communities have some basic level of infrastructure to provide opportunities to all. The challenge has been that our spending on things like education has declined, even despite the recovery. So even as revenues have recovered, we've seen a decline in our investment in spending, even as our numbers of students have increased. So This just shows you the trend of state spending per pupil is nearly $500 below where we were before the recession started. So I think if some of you were here for my presentation when I first came out here, I talked about a policy idea that is being considered, has been considered, voted on, approved in the Senate, could be considered in the House, which would lock in low levels of spending for North Carolina. It's called a TABOR. And what it would do is amend our state constitution to limit the growth in spending at the state level to population plus inflation. It would cap the income tax rate at a low 5%, and it would limit the ways in which policymakers can access the rainy day fund. They would basically need to have a supermajority to access that money in a time of emergency, which makes the process more susceptible to special interests. So it's a very concerning proposal, and I think important for you all to know about, that could come down the line and could further erode our ability to really build this economy that works for everyone. So we at the Budget and Tax Center and the North Carolina Justice Center are constantly thinking about the policy ideas that have the greatest promise for building an economy that works for all. Some of the ideas that were talked about as it relates to poverty are ones that we've worked on and promoted over the years. I think in addition, I just want to mention that one critical area of investment that I didn't spend much time on, but hopefully maybe you could talk to as well, is the role of small business development and entrepreneurship support. We know that many of the communities across the state are going to grow strong by having vibrant main streets, by having the resources to support small businesses as they try to expand, as they try to start up. And those businesses can be anything from retail to high tech. But we know that small business is a key tool in North Carolina's economy for really making sure that folks have opportunities to earn and grow with their economy. So with that, I'll stop. We have some tools for engagement and ways for you to get engaged with our work, and my email and phone number.